Chief Justice John Roberts attacks Jasmine Crockett's education. So she exposed his fake law degree. The marble halls of the Supreme Court were quiet, eerily so. The usual buzz of political maneuvering and legal discourse had turned into a stunned silence as Chief Justice John Roberts leaned forward. His face, usually a mask of calm, now held an unusual sharpness. He was addressing Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and from the looks on the faces of everyone in the room, no one expected what was about to happen. Roberts' voice rang out with an air of superiority, his words aimed directly at the Texas Congresswoman. "Your questions demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the Constitution's separation of powers," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "Perhaps if you had attended a more rigorous law school, you would understand these basic principles." The words hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Members of the committee glanced at each other, stunned by the personal attack. No one had ever seen the Chief Justice of the United States, the highest judicial officer in the land, speak like this, especially not in the middle of a formal congressional hearing. Crockett remained calm, her face a study of composure, betraying no emotion despite the gravity of the attack. She had prepared for this moment. But what came next was unexpected. The Chief Justice, the most respected figure in the American judiciary, had just made a rookie mistake. He underestimated her. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't respond immediately, as some might have expected. Instead, she slowly opened her leather portfolio, removing a single document. The room fell silent as she placed the paper in front of her. "Mr. Chief Justice," she said, her voice steady and measured, "before I respond to your assessment of my legal education, I would like to address a more important matter, one that has come to light recently regarding your own credentials." Roberts shifted in his seat, his body language suddenly tense. He had been calm, authoritative, even up until this point. But Crockett was no ordinary Congresswoman. She wasn't about to be steamrolled. She had done her homework, and it was now time for the Chief Justice to answer for himself. Crockett held up the document, making sure Roberts saw it clearly. It was a certified letter from Harvard Law School's registrar's office. The letter was obtained through a Freedom of Information request, revealing something shocking. According to official Harvard records, Crockett began, her eyes locking with Roberts. "Your academic transcript does not match the enhanced version submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee during your confirmation process in 2005. It contains discrepancies that demand an explanation." The room gasped. For a moment it felt as though time had stopped. The implications of this revelation were enormous. Roberts, ever the composed figure, maintained his poise barely. His face drained of color, but he didn't respond. He simply stared at the document, trying to make sense of the situation. Crockett was relentless, showing no mercy. "This document," she continued, "shows that while you graduated from Harvard with honors, the version submitted to the Senate claimed you had received the prestigious F.A. diploma awarded to the student with the highest combined average for 3 years of law study. Yet according to Harvard's records, that honor went to someone else." The room was tense now, and the reporters frantically typed out notes, knowing they were witnessing something historic. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a figurehead of legal integrity, was being cornered. "And that's not all," Crockett added, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The transcript provided during your confirmation also indicated that you served as managing editor of the Harvard Law Review. Yet according to Harvard's records, you were only a general editor. These discrepancies raise serious questions about the accuracy of the credentials you presented during your confirmation process." The impact of Crockett's revelation was immediate and devastating. The tension in the room was palpable. Roberts had spent years cultivating an image of intellectual rigor, of being above reproach. Now Crockett was peeling back the layers of that carefully constructed persona. Roberts' grip on the armrest tightened. He knew he had been caught. The allegations were serious, and they went straight to the heart of his credibility. "Mr. Chief Justice, Crockett said, her tone now firm and unwavering, "I'm not questioning your graduation from Harvard or your legal qualifications. I'm questioning the accuracy of the credentials you submitted to the Senate during your confirmation process. These discrepancies cannot be ignored." For a few moments, Roberts remained silent, seemingly lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Congresswoman," he began, "I would need to review these materials before responding to such serious allegations. The confirmation process occurred nearly 2 decades ago, and I cannot speak to potential clerical errors in how my credentials were presented." But Crockett wasn't done. She hadn't come this far just to let him off the hook. "I understand, Mr. Chief Justice, but the fact remains that these discrepancies exist. They are a matter of public record, and they raise legitimate concerns about transparency and accountability." The Chief Justice had no choice but to confront the reality that his position, once untouchable, was now under serious scrutiny. His reputation, built on years of careful public relations, was suddenly at risk. For the first time in his career, Roberts had been caught in a situation where his authority was being directly challenged. It wasn't just a matter of legal theory anymore. This was about power, integrity, and accountability. As the room fell into an uneasy silence, Crockett turned to the committee. "This," she said, "is precisely why transparency is essential. No one, not even the highest judicial officers in the land, should be beyond scrutiny." The message was clear. Accountability had come to the highest echelons of the judicial system, and it wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the room remained thick as all eyes were fixed on Chief Justice Roberts. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a quiet, palpable tension. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the edges of the table, trying to maintain his composure. The words Crockett had dropped were still hanging in the air, like an elephant in the room that no one could ignore. The room was now split in two. Half the members of Congress seemed stunned, while the other half whispered in hushed tones, processing what had just happened. For a moment, Roberts remained silent, his mind racing as the weight of Crockett's allegations sank in. The Chief Justice of the United States, an institution in himself, had just had his academic integrity called into question. Not just by any ordinary person, but by a sitting Congresswoman who had spent years developing a reputation as a fierce legal advocate. When Roberts spoke again, his voice was noticeably softer. He knew that his next words could either salvage or further damage his position. "Congresswoman Crockett," Roberts said, choosing his words carefully, "I recognize the gravity of the claims you've made, and I want to assure you that I am committed to addressing them thoroughly." The committee members, still in shock, leaned forward, eager to hear what Roberts had to say next. Was he going to challenge the allegations, deny them, or was he going to acknowledge the discrepancies and apologize? Roberts continued, but his usual authoritative tone was replaced with something less certain. "While I do not have all the details at this moment, I understand that the public has every right to question the accuracy of my credentials, especially if they are being presented as part of an official Senate confirmation process." Crockett, unfazed by the shift in tone, remained composed. She had delivered her point with precision, and now she let Roberts stew in the consequences of his words. The silence stretched on until the Chief Justice finally leaned forward, his posture now much less rigid. "I will take full responsibility for any discrepancies that have been identified, and I will cooperate fully in rectifying any errors that may have occurred. However, I must also address the conduct of this hearing." The committee members, not knowing where this was going, looked on, unsure of what Roberts meant. "I deeply regret my earlier comments," he added, "concerning your educational background, Congresswoman Crockett. My remarks were unprofessional and, quite frankly, beneath the standards I've tried to uphold throughout my career. I was wrong, and for that I offer my sincere apology." The room went silent again. This time it wasn't a stunned silence. It was a silence of shock mixed with reluctant admiration. No one had expected such an admission from the Chief Justice. For years, Roberts had been known for his poised demeanor and measured responses. But here he was acknowledging his own faults in a public forum, something few would have imagined. Crockett took a moment to process the apology. She didn't jump on it. She didn't take the easy route and gloat over her victory. Instead, she nodded with acknowledgement, but her expression remained steady. She knew the fight was far from over. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice," she said. "I appreciate your willingness to address these issues. However, it is crucial that this hearing focuses not just on personal missteps, but on the broader need for institutional reform. We need transparency, genuine transparency. The American people deserve nothing less." Her words echoed through the chamber, reinforcing her earlier message. This wasn't just about a personal affront or the Chief Justice's credentials. It was about accountability, about ensuring that the most powerful institutions in the land were not immune to scrutiny. As the session continued, Roberts shifted in his chair, visibly shaken by the turn of events. He had never expected this kind of response from Crockett. His position had been imperiled, but there was still work to be done. Roberts had been forced into a corner by Crockett's revelations, but he wasn't about to go down without making his case. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his voice now more controlled, "I understand the need for greater transparency. In fact, I've already requested that the Supreme Court implement some internal changes, including more rigorous financial disclosures and clearer guidelines for recusal." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "But let's be clear, this is not just about me. This is about the future of the judicial system. If we don't take action now to address these ethical concerns, we risk undermining the public's trust in the very institutions that are supposed to protect their rights." There was a slight shift in the room's energy. Some of the committee members, especially those from Roberts' political circle, nodded in agreement, but others, particularly those from the Democratic side, remained skeptical. The conversation was becoming more complicated. It was no longer just a personal matter between Roberts and Crockett. It had grown into a national discussion about judicial accountability and the role of the Supreme Court in modern American society. As the session continued, Crockett's questions grew sharper, more focused. She pressed Roberts on specific reforms. She demanded answers about the lack of ethics rules within the Supreme Court, about the need for clear processes to deal with conflicts of interest and recusal. "Mr. Chief Justice, you say that internal reforms are underway. But when will the public see those reforms? When will we know that the changes are real, not just promises made in the heat of a congressional hearing?" Crockett asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Roberts paused before answering clearly, uncomfortable with the line of questioning. He had been caught off guard earlier, but now it was clear that Crockett wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. "We are working on it," Roberts said, his tone more measured now. "But these are complex matters. The court is independent, and it must be allowed to function without interference. We can't rush these changes. They must be carefully considered." Crockett wasn't satisfied. "Mr. Chief Justice, the problem is that the court has had ample time to consider these changes. The time for consideration is over. The time for action is now." The room was electric with the back and forth. Crockett's persistence and Roberts' increasing discomfort were a reminder of just how far the conversation had come. This was no longer a simple hearing. It was a battle over the future of judicial transparency. As the hearing went on, the shift in tone was undeniable. What had started as a moment of personal conflict had now morphed into something much larger, a national reckoning with the ethical standards of the nation's highest court. By the time the session drew to a close, everyone in the room knew that this hearing would go down in history. The Chief Justice had been publicly humiliated, but he had also made promises of reform that could alter the future of the court. Crockett, though, wasn't done. She knew this was only the beginning. As the congressional hearing came to a close, the ripple effects were immediately felt far beyond the walls of the chamber. Journalists flooded the room, their pens and cameras capturing the unexpected twist in the narrative. Chief Justice Roberts had offered a public apology, something so rare it had left everyone in attendance stunned. But it wasn't just his apology that dominated the headlines. The entire hearing had shifted the conversation from a procedural inquiry into ethical lapses within the Supreme Court to a broader reckoning on the court's very legitimacy. Outside the Capitol, the political ramifications of the hearing were felt immediately. conservative voices were divided. Some were quick to rally behind Roberts, defending his leadership and framing the confrontation as an unfortunate misstep in an otherwise distinguished career. Others, however, couldn't ignore the significance of what had transpired. Roberts had lost his aura of invincibility. By acknowledging the discrepancies in his credentials and apologizing publicly, he had opened a door that could no longer be closed. His image, once synonymous with the steady hand of judicial conservatism, had been tarnished. The most immediate consequence, however, was felt within the halls of the Supreme Court. Roberts, now facing an unprecedented level of scrutiny, knew that the court could no longer operate as it had before. The moment had revealed the vulnerabilities in the court's long-standing tradition of self-regulation. His public apology and commitment to reforms had to be followed up with concrete actions. Within days of the hearing, Roberts called a meeting with the other justices to discuss the implications of what had transpired. The justices, many of whom had remained silent during the hearing, now faced a crucial decision. Would they support Roberts' call for reform, or would they retreat into the traditional stance of judicial independence that had often been used as a shield against external pressure? The response was mixed. Some justices, particularly those appointed during more conservative administrations, voiced strong reservations about the need for external accountability. They argued that any significant reforms could undermine the court's independence and set a dangerous precedent. But Roberts, now fully aware of the public's deepening mistrust, knew that the court couldn't afford to ignore the growing demand for transparency. Meanwhile, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's stock within Washington had risen sharply. Her sharp legal mind and steady composure during the hearing had earned her praise across political lines. She had not only exposed the ethical concerns within the court, but she had also emerged as one of the most formidable voices in the debate over judicial transparency. Political observers noted that Crockett had not just won a personal victory by challenging Roberts. She had managed to shift the narrative, making the conversation about ethics, transparency, and institutional accountability. Her focus on the larger issues at play, rather than personal vindication, had earned her respect from both sides of the aisle. Back in her office, Crockett reflected on the enormity of what had transpired. She knew that she had helped expose the flaws in a system that had long been beyond reproach, but she also knew that the road ahead was going to be challenging. Judicial reform was a long game, and the fight for true transparency would not be won in a single hearing. She was already preparing for the next battle this time, not just against Roberts, but against the very structures that had allowed the court to operate without meaningful oversight for so long. For now, though, the victory was hers. Roberts had apologized, and the Supreme Court had been forced to acknowledge the need for reform. The question now was, how far would they go to restore public trust? Only time would tell. In the days following the historic congressional hearing, the momentum for change only grew. Public opinion polls showed a surge in support for increased judicial transparency and ethical reforms within the Supreme Court. The combination of Roberts' rare public apology and the exposure of discrepancies in his own academic credentials had shaken the foundation of the court's long-held image of unassailable authority. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the fight was far from over. Her victory in the hearing had garnered her widespread acclaim, but it had also drawn the attention of those who sought to undermine her progress. Political opponents, particularly within conservative circles, tried to downplay the significance of the hearing, framing Roberts' apology as an isolated incident rather than part of a larger systemic issue. They were eager to move past the confrontation, casting it as little more than an embarrassing moment for Roberts that could be swept under the rug. But Crockett wasn't about to let that happen. She understood that the Supreme Court's credibility and the credibility of the entire judicial system rested on more than just one public apology. It required institutional change, and for that she would need both allies and a sustained political will. As her office worked on drafting legislation for more robust ethics regulations, Crockett began organizing a coalition of lawmakers who shared her vision for reform. She called it the Judicial Accountability Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that would mandate full financial disclosure for all Supreme Court justices, a formal ethics code, and a transparent recusal process for justices involved in cases where conflicts of interest were possible. Her goal was simple: to ensure that no one, not even the highest judicial officer in the country, was above the law. But not everyone was on board. A vocal group of senior Republicans, led by House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan, pushed back against Crockett's proposal. They argued that any legislative effort to impose further accountability on the Supreme Court would infringe on the separation of powers, an argument frequently used by judicial conservatives to resist reform. The judiciary has its own internal mechanisms for dealing with ethical violations, Jordan said in a press conference. We don't need Congress meddling in that process. The independence of the court is what makes America's justice system the gold standard for the world. Crockett, however, wasn't backing down. While Jordan and his allies took to the airwaves defending judicial independence, Crockett focused on leveraging public opinion. She knew the key to breaking through the conservative resistance was building a broad base of support from the American people, particularly those disillusioned by the court's perceived lack of accountability. She held town halls and press conferences, constantly driving home the message that transparency wasn't an attack on the court, but a necessary measure to ensure its legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And her efforts weren't in vain. A series of investigative reports into the financial relationships between the court's justices and wealthy donors with business before the court further fueled the push for reform. These revelations, coupled with Roberts' own public acknowledgement of ethical lapses, gave Crockett's movement the ammunition it needed. People were beginning to ask why certain justices seemed to live under a different set of rules than the rest of the country. Meanwhile, within the Supreme Court, Roberts continued to grapple with the fallout. His public apology, though necessary, had not been enough to quell the rising tide of public scrutiny. Behind closed doors, he met with his fellow justices to discuss the future of the court. The question of whether to adopt a formal ethics code and stronger disclosure requirements weighed heavily on the justices. Some, like Justice Clarence Thomas, remained opposed to any meaningful change, arguing that the court had successfully self-regulated for over 2 centuries and should continue to do so. Others, particularly those appointed during more liberal administrations, sided with Roberts in acknowledging that change was necessary to restore public confidence. At the same time, legal scholars and former clerks began to weigh in on the issue, adding academic rigor to the debate. Many pointed out that while the court had long operated under the assumption of judicial independence, it was becoming increasingly clear that unchecked power, even within the judiciary, was detrimental to democracy. For Crockett, the work was just beginning. She had shifted the conversation, but she knew that true reform would take time. There would be roadblocks, there would be resistance, but she was committed to ensuring that the court would no longer be a law unto itself. As the months passed, following the explosive congressional hearing, the nation's focus remained fixed on the Supreme Court and the battle for judicial reform. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had emerged as a key figure in the fight for transparency, her calls for sweeping changes resonating with the American public. However, despite her growing influence, the struggle was far from over. Roberts' apology had not been enough to silence the critics. The court's refusal to adopt substantive reforms in the wake of the hearing only deepened public distrust. The question loomed larger than ever: could the nation's highest court really police itself? And more importantly, would Congress allow the judiciary to continue evading accountability? Crockett's Judicial Accountability Act remained at the center of the legislative struggle. In the halls of Congress, the proposal continued to face staunch opposition from the conservative wing, but public support for the bill had steadily increased. Polls indicated that a majority of Americans believed the Supreme Court needed to adopt a formal ethics code and stricter financial disclosure requirements. Even some conservative-leaning voters had started to see the value in reform, especially as new reports highlighted the vast wealth of certain justices and their ties to influential political donors. Still, the legislative battle remained a steep climb. In a closed-door meeting of the House Judiciary Committee, Crockett presented the latest round of evidence to sway undecided members. The room was filled with the familiar faces of her fellow committee members, some supportive, others not so much. Chairman Jim Jordan, a vocal critic of Crockett's reforms, sat with his arms crossed, his eyes locked on her. He'd spent months trying to discredit the need for judicial accountability, framing it as an attack on the court's independence. But Crockett was undeterred. "Mr. Chairman, the public no longer sees the court as the unbiased, impartial body it once was," Crockett began. "These are not just personal attacks. This is about restoring the legitimacy of the court. This is about ensuring that no justice, no matter how powerful, is above the law." She went on to explain the latest findings from investigative reports that had linked several justices to lavish gifts and undisclosed financial interests, including luxury vacations funded by corporate donors. These revelations were too significant to ignore, and they further validated the need for reform. Jordan's expression remained stoic, but Crockett could tell she was making headway. His resistance had softened somewhat, though he continued to argue that the court's independence needed to be preserved. "We're not asking for a revolution here, Jim," she said, her voice firm but measured. "All we're asking is that the justices follow the same rules that apply to everyone else in this country. No more special treatment." As the meeting drew to a close, the debate had only just begun. While Crockett was able to gain some important allies within her own party, it was clear that the fight would not be won in the committee rooms alone. The full House would need to vote on the bill, and that would require a majority of lawmakers willing to stand with her. Meanwhile, outside the halls of Congress, Crockett continued to amplify her message. In interviews with major news outlets, she stressed the importance of reform, highlighting how public confidence in the judiciary had plummeted. She appeared on talk shows, engaged in heated debates, and used every platform available to pressure lawmakers into action. Despite the growing momentum, the fight was still a long one. Some members of Congress, particularly those with close ties to conservative donors or legal elites, continued to push back against the proposed reforms, warning that they could have unintended consequences. They argued that the reforms could undermine the court's ability to function independently, opening the door for partisan interference in judicial decisions. Crockett, however, remained resolute. She understood that the stakes were higher than just her own political career. This was about the future of American democracy. Then, just as momentum seemed to be shifting in her favor, a shocking twist emerged. Reports surfaced that Justice Clarence Thomas, a longtime conservative stalwart, had failed to disclose several significant financial ties to political donors, with cases pending before the court. The revelations were stunning, and they reignited the debate over the court's ethics or lack thereof. The allegations, if proven true, were a clear violation of the very principles Crockett had been fighting for. This development turned the tide in the legislative battle. Thomas's failure to disclose these financial interests put the entire court's credibility in question. Crockett seized on the moment, making the case that reforms weren't just necessary, they were urgent. "I didn't need more proof to make my case, but this is it," Crockett told reporters. "This is exactly why we need to pass the Judicial Accountability Act, because right now, the system is broken and no one is watching the watchman." With public opinion behind her, Crockett redoubled her efforts. The stage was set for a historic vote in Congress, a vote that could change the course of the Supreme Court's future and perhaps the future of judicial power in America. The final battle for judicial accountability had arrived. After months of political maneuvering, public debates, and relentless media scrutiny, Congress was finally preparing to vote on the Judicial Accountability Act. The bill, spearheaded by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, had gained significant momentum. What had started as an underdog cause overshadowed by institutional power had blossomed into a national movement demanding transparency and reform at the highest levels of American government. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. In the days leading up to the vote, Crockett knew that every word, every argument would matter. The legislative halls were buzzing with rumors of last-minute changes, and fierce lobbying as conservative forces rallied against her reform efforts. Some tried to use scare tactics, warning that passing such reforms would open the floodgates for partisan attacks on the judiciary. Others, however, began to soften their stance, realizing that the growing public pressure couldn't be ignored. It was in the midst of this high-stakes tension that the breaking news hit. Justice Clarence Thomas, already under fire for his undisclosed financial ties, had made a public statement, one that shocked both his supporters and detractors alike. In a rare moment of candor, Thomas admitted to failing to disclose his financial dealings, but claimed that it had been an oversight, not an intentional violation of ethics. His apology, though terse, sent shockwaves through the political and legal landscapes. Many saw it as a victory for Crockett's fight for transparency. It was clear that the Supreme Court had been unable to escape the scrutiny any longer. Crockett was quick to respond. "We've been demanding accountability, and now, finally, even the justices are being forced to acknowledge the truth," she said, in an impassioned speech to the press. "This is a turning point. It proves that no one, not even the highest judicial officers in the land, is above the law." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Congress grew charged. It wasn't just about the bill anymore. It was about a system that had been allowed to operate with a glaring lack of accountability for far too long. Even the most hardened political opponents of Crockett's bill began to waver. They couldn't ignore the mounting evidence, nor the shift in public opinion. The pressure was too great to withstand. On the day of the vote, the chamber was packed. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle took their seats, some confident, others nervous. Cameras flashed, capturing the tense anticipation in the air. Crockett entered the room, her resolve unwavering. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and now it was time to push through the final obstacle. As the vote began, the air felt heavy with the weight of history. One by one, members of Congress cast their ballots, and the results were tallied. The final count came through a clear majority in favor of the Judicial Accountability Act. The cheers from her allies were deafening, but Crockett remained composed. Her eyes focused on the task ahead. Crockett had won. The bill passed, securing reforms that would forever change the way the Supreme Court operated. It mandated financial disclosures, imposed a formal ethics code, and introduced a system for reviewing conflicts of interest reforms that would hold justices accountable, just as Crockett had envisioned. But the victory was not just political, it was symbolic. For Crockett, this moment represented a triumph of principle over power. It showed that with enough determination and public support, even the most entrenched institutions could be forced to evolve. As the results of the vote were announced, Crockett stood at the podium, surrounded by her supporters. She spoke to the media, her words resonating with the weight of what had just been accomplished. "This is not just a win for me," she said, her voice steady and strong. "This is a win for every American who believes that justice should be impartial, transparent, and accountable. We've taken the first step toward rebuilding trust in our highest court." And as she walked out of the chamber, Crockett knew this battle was just the beginning. The fight for judicial accountability had taken a significant leap forward, but the work was far from over. For now, though, she could take a moment to savor the victory. It was a hard-earned triumph, the culmination of a struggle that had changed the face of American democracy.